the kind of inflation caused by an increase in demand is the kind that the market can actually deal with. But for example, boy, when we have a shortage of labor over here in this country, oh no, we better throw the economy into recession. There's a shortage of labor, which might drive wages and prices up. Isn't that okay? Oh no, there's an increase in demand for Walmart stock. Let's throw the economy into recession. We don't do that, but we do when it's people.
This is the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far, and thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley, and unfortunately Patricia is away for this episode. But to console me, I am delighted and honored and just bowled over to be joined today by author and professor of cowboy economics. It's Professor John T. Harvey. Thanks so much for joining me today, John.
Thank you as always. I wish it could be in person again like it was last month, where we shared a pint at one of your favorite pubs.
That's right. And you were taking it very steady, and I felt the need to compensate.
And I appreciated that. I was on antibiotics at the time, actually, so I probably shouldn't have been drinking at all, but I had to be friendly.
That's absolutely right, yeah. It wasn't you, it was convention. So I really wanted to get into your chapter in MMT Key Insights Leading Thinkers. But first, let's address the downgrade. The rating agency Fitch recently revised the creditworthiness of the United States government downward from AAA to AA+. John, are you worried? Did Uncle Sam owe you some money? What's going on over there?
Boy, it's just terrifying. Well, I got to say, if you look up their actual words on why they downgraded it, the first 2 things they said were ridiculous. One of the reasons was the expected fiscal deterioration of the next 3 years. And then the second was a high and growing general government debt burden. Well, as we know very well, it is impossible for the United States to be forced into debt default. They could choose to do so if they wanted to, just as a person could choose not to eat in a warehouse full of food, but there's absolutely no need. And this is one of those things where, well, that's your theory. Well, no, it's not. It's law. All right. So, I mean, and we can cite, this is the one time when it's okay to do appeal to authority, because it is an authoritative thing. And I can read all these quotes I have out here in front of me, but let me read just this one from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. As the sole manufacturer of dollars, whose debt is denominated in dollars, the U.S. government can never become insolvent, that is, unable to pay its bills. In this sense, the government is not dependent on credit markets to remain operational. So it's off the table, completely off the table. The one thing that the crediting agency did say that made sense was, they said the other thing that worried them was the erosion of governance. Yeah, over the last 2 decades, it has manifested itself in repeated debt limit standoffs and last-minute resolutions. Now, I'm not worried about the debt limit per se, but yeah, it's a dysfunctional government. And I guess in my Forbes thing where I wrote about this, I said that part's right. It is an erosion of governance. But honestly, in the context of that, the debt is the last thing we need to worry about. It's all the other screwed up things in the United States that are our problem because we can't possibly address them.
I think it was Pavlina Chernova had a nice response to that on Twitter. And somebody talked about, but there is this erosion of government that might lead to a default. And Pavlina responded, the doctor may choose not to operate and save the life of the patient is not a useful take.
Right. And again, I mean, it's an erosion of governance, but honestly, What I'm worried about is climate change, income maldistribution, the deterioration of the rights of LGBTQ, and who knows who else is on the chopping block here as we move forward. So, yeah, even the place where they had a point, the point really wasn't relevant to what they were talking about, i.e. the real problems are the other, guns everywhere on the streets here in my current home state of Texas, especially. All very depressing.
So there are people who would say, or that they thought the idea of minting $1 trillion coin as a way to get around that debt ceiling drama that just keeps coming up, won't go away. People thought that was gimmicky. Some people, I've never been one of those. I like the idea, but I'd say this week it looks even more credible as a way to just stop the madness every time the Republicans, and it's always the Republicans without fail, weaponize the debt ceiling.
And the interesting thing, of course, is that when they're in power, they don't worry about it.
Yeah, yeah.
They spend the money on whatever they want. And as Dick Cheney once said, the deficits don't matter. And that's right. But then the Democrats think very much that I told Melanie, she will back me up on this. Back when Clinton had those surpluses, I said, this is absolutely going to be a nightmare.
Yeah.
Because from here forward, the Democrats are going to use that as their example of how responsible they are. Yes, you want to help poor people, and that seems awfully irresponsible, doesn't it? But we're going to balance that. Well, I say that, and Clinton ended welfare as we know it. But going all the way back to that, they do worry about it. Then as you say, the Republicans weaponize it, but their only real goal is to shut out particular programs. They care about the deficit, but they care about spending money to help poor people go to school and stuff like that.
Yeah, they actually don't care about the size of government. They care about the size of parts of the government that help people.
Right, exactly.
So in your recent Forbes piece, which you were talking about, it's called Should We Downgrade Fitch or the USA? In that piece, you included a absolute heap of quotes from various authoritative sources. One of my favorites was this one: there is no inherent limit on federal expenses and therefore on federal spending. When the US government decides to spend money, it adds to its banking reserve system, and when it taxes or borrows, it drains reserves from its banking system. These reserve operations are done solely to maintain the target federal funds rate. But I like that quote because it's got that MMT insight that government bond sales are a reserve drain. And we don't shy away from the technical stuff here. What do we mean by that?
Right. And that what we're trying to do is maintain the federal funds rate, because this is why the Fed wants the Treasury to coordinate with them. And it's really fun to do this in class, because the students can work it out as you work your way through it. So let's say that the government wants to spend in deficit. They go ahead and write their checks and they increase the supply of money in the banking system. Then what's it going to do to the total reserves in the banking system? Are they going to go up or down? No, they're going to go up. That's right. So what's the Fed's target for the interest rate going to do? They're going to miss their target. Which way? Well, the interest rates are going to go down. So they have to drain reserves. So they're going to have to sell these Treasury bills to drain the money back out. They didn't need to sell the Treasury bills to get the money that the government was going to spend. They needed to sell the Treasury bills to drain the money that the government did spend. And there's a wonderful, I cited it in the book I'm working on right now that I hopefully will be done by Christmas. Not published by then, certainly, but hopefully done by then. In my last chapter, it's a book on business cycles. And I don't really talk about MMT stuff out loud. Honestly, I shouldn't be letting everybody know this. I do that as kind of a strategy. I don't want to say MMT at the outset because I don't want someone, oh, that's a bunch of crap. Instead, you lay things out and you say, oh, by the way, you just agree with MMT. I hate to tell you that. So anyway, that's my strategy. So for like the first 4 chapters of the book, I say things that are consistent, but I don't ever call it that until one paragraph in chapter 5. And I take several quotes from Eric Timoin, which are really good, about the way that the Massachusetts Bay Colony operated. They had a very explicit understanding that they wrote down about the way government spending was working for them. They needed to buy, I don't know, let's make something up here, a couple of buildings for a post office. They didn't wait to tax the money away from people and then spend it. They just made up some money. All right, they said, okay, we're going to buy these boards and so forth, and we're going to issue this currency here. Hey, but why should I, as a carpenter, accept this currency? Oh, did I mention we're going to have taxes now? And so at the end of the year, we're going to owe some of this back. And what they eventually found out was that this was extremely popular, that people wanted to hold. They weren't simply draining the funds out that they put in every year, that actually people wanted there to be a net increase in the number of these bills. And you start with a nice, simple, easy example like that. You're like, oh, yeah, okay, it makes sense. And then you can start adding detail of a modern capitalist economy. And I know I'm told this story before on here, Patton understood some sense of this when he was in charge of the U.S. forces in Casablanca after Operation Torch. They were trying to get some local labor to help unload ships. And they said, hey, we'll give you U.S. Army scrip, the money that they issue in the Army. And they said, what do we want this for? Now, they didn't tax them because that wouldn't have gone over too well. What they said was, oh, did we mention we're going to leave the base store open to you? All right. So, but you can only use this money. This is the only money you can use there. Oh my gosh, the overwhelming number of people wanted to work for them unloading ships now because there were things they could buy at the base store they couldn't get anywhere else. So it's a wonderful quote from Minsky. Anybody can make up their own money. The trick is to getting somebody else to accept it.
And like we've said many times on the show, taxes are the way you do the trick, generally.
Yeah.
So back to your article, though, you also wrote in that article, although default is definitely off the table, this doesn't mean that there can't be other consequences to government spending, like inflation or crowding out of the private sector. But then you emphasize both of which would require that we are already at full employment. And that's the real caveat, which a lot of people miss, that the economy would have to be at full employment for those things to happen.
Right. Yeah, I just gave a talk to a local civic group. It went fairly well, except that two of the people that were there were pretty quiet the whole time and then became a lot less quiet at the end as they told me how wrong I was. And one of the things that they emphasized was I think at some point I brought up the job program. I said, well, how would we fix this? I said, well, a job program. Okay. Well, I don't want my money going for that. So, well, it would be deficit spending. Yeah, but I don't want my tax money going for that. But if it's a deficit, it's not tax money. Literally, other members of the audience had to eventually correct this person. Yeah, no, that's not tax money. I put that in one of my early Forbes pieces on a list of fallacies about federal government spending is that it's my tax money. All right. Well, no, by definition, it's not. He did eventually bring up, well, I'll have to pay it back someday. No, you won't. But thank you for moving the target and trying to get your answer to be right. We eventually, and then another fellow that was sitting right next to him that also clearly thought I was terribly wrong said that, well, name one time when this has actually worked, a jobs program. And this is, I'm getting around to your question about inflation and so forth. And I said, well, World War II. And you know where the guy took it? Well, but millions of people had to die. And I try to stay very respectful at a level that is beyond what a person necessarily even deserves. But I couldn't help myself. I said, well, that's not what I'm talking about. So I mean the fact that there were jobs for everyone, that we were able to justify to ourselves philosophically the government taking such a massive role in the economy. I says, and so we had, 1.9% unemployment. I said, but we did have inflation and we did have government capture of resources. So these are the two things that we talk about that could potentially become a problem. And the only time that I can possibly think of in American economic history where we have had a problem of job program created inflation was World War II. But we knew it, all right? And we were perfectly okay with the fact that we were capturing resources. That was the whole point. We didn't want those resources to be made to build a new Ford. We wanted them to be made to build a new Sherman. Now, what they did, of course, was we had the bond drives, which is fascinating. That's actually one of my favorite Cowboy Economist videos that I ever did was my one on World War II financing, where I talk about the Ken Burns series that was so good on World War II. But he had like a whole episode on how America paid for the war itself. It's amazing the American people paid for the war themselves. What does that even mean? So what that implies is, so let's do a little counterfactual. What that implies is that, let's say that's true. Let's say that we couldn't have activated the massive arsenal of democracy without enough government borrowing from the private sector. Well, so if people hadn't saved up enough money during the Great Depression, then despite our massive productive capacity, population, resources, we would have had to have said, well, we can't build a tank. I mean, the steel's laying right there and the factory's right there. And we've got 5 people that are just anxious to be a tank crew, but we don't have the money. So come on in, Hitler. And we know that's not true. We know that all you had to do was, I hate to say it this way, but we just had to print some money. You print the money, you build the factory, you give the person the job, and now they have this income that they can go out and spend and cause inflation with that income. And so what we do instead is we say, hey, you know what? We need you to save that money. We need you to buy a war bond to help keep these planes flying. We don't really need that. But that's the best way to sell it. And unfortunately, it builds around this whole myth of the government borrowing money and being able to go bankrupt, but nevertheless. And so if you read the contemporary documents, they keep talking about dangerous dollars. We need to suck these out of the economy to prevent the inflation. That was the big goal. Now, did they also think that they were financing the war effort? Yes, that came through too. All right, that did. Of course, then we have, what's his name, Beardsley Rummel after the war. Taxes are not necessary for...
Taxes for revenue are obsolete.
That's it. Taxes for revenue are obsolete. That's right. So there were people at some level that understood the sort of bigger picture here.
Yeah. Since you bring it up, because I want to get to the exchange rate question in a minute, but I think it's good that politicians know they need to at least look like they're doing something about climate change. I would say the Biden administration are doing a bit more than we're doing, and it shows. But my problem with governments over here, and more importantly, governments in waiting over here, progressives will advocate proposing to issue green bonds or create, and this is a Labour Party thing, to create a national wealth fund for green investment. And my problem is that these things, like you just said, they reinforce this idea that the government can't do anything to bring about a transition, just stand back, wait for the private sector to be willing to pitch in to some fund to save the planet, where we all know that's not where the government gets its spending money from. But channeling one of our previous guests, Sam Levy, who's done fantastic stuff about the war mobilizations, in Sam's writing, if I remember right, he talks about this decision that was made in World War II to sell war bonds to the public as, we're using your money that you've lent to us to pay for the war. We'll give it back to you later with interest, because it was easier to swallow. They're in a rush. They've got to sell the bonds. And they use that sales tactic rather than the truth, which is actually we're using your deferred consumption as a counter-inflationary measure.
Yeah, we just assume you not spend money right now because it's going to cause inflation. And apparently another factor was that there'd been a recession after World War I as the economy slowed down. And there was like, well, okay, so if these war bonds mature after the war is over, that could potentially offset. All of a sudden, we've got all this money in the public's hands to make sure that the cutback in government spending is offset by an increase in consumer spending, which again is a harder sell than we need you to keep these planes flying.
Yeah, we need you to keep these planes flying is much easier than we're rewarding you with an interest rate for not spending your money. It doesn't sound quite as heroic. And so I think we're in the same situation again. Economists who definitely know better are choosing to push this intuitively easy but incorrect framework.
I want to see that, though. I want to see like an old Fry and Laurie or something like that, where they try to do a bond sale drive, but for the reasons that is really true. I shot down 6 Messerschmitts over the channel. I'm a war hero. And gosh, if you spend your money now, it might cause the price of milk to go up. So what we really need you to do.
So turning the corner, and let's go into your chapter in MMT, Key Insights, Leading Thinkers. You write the idea that MMT-inspired policies will cause a domestic currency collapse not only leans on the idea that we're at full employment, which we've dealt with, but also it leans on a model of exchange rate determination that ignores roughly 90% of currency transactions. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, see, I guess the first thing that happened was it was a book that Randy Ray was putting together with
Yeva Nassisian.
Yes, thank you. They wanted something written for the general public on this issue. And I mentioned my idea to Randy. He's like, I like that. I said, okay, so all right, so I'll do that. Then Phil Armstrong, they wanted something like that, but more technical, because we want to be able to show when people ask, this isn't just an op-ed somewhere. There's actually, sometimes you got to play their game, right? So there's actually some math behind it. So I was like, oh, that actually sounds fun. I would like to do that. And so I did. And I basically took the earlier article and just put a lot of equations in it. And there ends up being, I guess at least 3 different key problems. One is that people say that, well, an MMT policy would cause this sort of unrestricted increases in the money supply that will cause inflation. Okay, well, first of all, why would they just keep increasing it? It's like saying, hey, if you put air in your tire, the tire is going to blow up. Well, you're right if I were to just keep on doing it once I went past the point of the manufacturer's suggested pounds per square inch, but I'm not going to do that, right? So I'm going to stop. But I only wanted to get it to 32 pounds per square inch. And so that's one problem. So why would they do that? The second problem is that printing money doesn't cause inflation anyway. And so it goes through that whole thing, that whole neoclassical idea that you can have an excess supply of money, that the Fed can create more money than people want. And so how do you get rid of money you don't want? You go off and spend it. But of course, we're assuming full employment. So once again, why were you increasing the money supply? But nevertheless, you go off and spend it and you drive up prices. When in fact, the Federal Reserve has no tool that would allow them to increase the money supply beyond what people want. Friedman uses a helicopter, and he has to, because there's no other way to do it. What they generally do in the U.S. is they buy treasury bills from the public. All right. So I cannot make you buy or sell your treasury bills. If I'm the Fed, it's a willing transaction. You don't, honey, did you accidentally sell the treasury bills last night? And so, oh my gosh, we have more money than we meant to have. So A, we would probably just go back and buy treasury bills with the money because we obviously weren't spending it to start with. It was part of our savings. It was part of our portfolio. And B, that can't really happen in the first place. But to be fair to the people attacking MMT, even though they're using the wrong understanding of it by applying the monetary policy side of it, fiscal policy can give people more money than they want. And by which I mean more money than I want to save. I want to go off and spend this money. Right? So fiscal policy can do that. We did that in the summer of 2020 when we gave everybody a $1,200 check. So okay, I'm going to grant you that. We can. All right. Again, we go back to the problem of why would we do that if we were already at full employment? But, let's not even worry about that. All right. So let's say it does cause prices to go up. Exchange rates are a financial asset that depends on, let's just do it real quick. Mainstream exchange rate theory depends on the idea that currency prices are a function of imports and exports of goods and services. That if the United States has a trade deficit to China, then this must mean that American goods and services are much less popular than Chinese. Therefore, the American dollar is much less popular than the Chinese yuan. Therefore, the American dollar will depreciate and the Chinese yuan will appreciate. It's purchasing power parity. And this is what I was taught in undergraduate and graduate school, and it's what I taught for many years, even though I would say, it doesn't sound right to me. I had a few things I could add in at the end. It was a little bit different. The problem is that roughly 5% of all transactions involving exchange rates actually have to do with goods and services. Some multiple of the 5% may be covering transactions where a financial institution undertook a couple of transactions to cover the fact that they were helping a local car dealership buy cars from Japan. So it could be bigger than 5%. So let's be crazy. Let's call it 20%. There's no way there's that many more transactions just related to the financing of the purchasing of the automobiles. But let's be crazy and say there are. That means 80% of the market is not directly related to U.S. imports and exports, all right? So what is it related to? Financial assets. People are buying the dollar in order to buy stock indices, in order to buy U.S. financial assets, all right? So it's the financial markets that are driving the currency market. And what I go to in the article eventually is, okay, financial markets are really driving currency markets, especially interest rates, at least in the current environment. And so let's say we have this economy that has an MMT policy, it's at full employment, and maybe there's a little inflation. Because we'd rather err on that side than less than full employment, is my own feeling. I know there's a lot of people say, well, there wouldn't be any inflation. I just don't care. I feel like, if there is, there is. I mean, because the kind of inflation that would exist under those circumstances is the good kind. I'll come back to that. But anyway, you're looking to invest, diversify your portfolio across the globe, and you're looking at different countries, and hey, here's one that's at full employment and that's growing really fast. And so it's got a little bit of inflation, but I think I want to invest there. That might actually cause the currency to appreciate. Not that that should be a goal in and of itself, but there's no reason to believe that inflation, would actually be a huge problem because, again, you're not going to continue to expand the economy after you've reached full employment. But anyway, not going to be a huge problem to start with. But B, it's maybe 20% of the market and probably closer to 5%. So why would the focal point be on this thing that is 5% of the total demand for the currency? It's extremely unlikely to happen. It's much more likely that if a job program is in place, you're going to have a strong economy, and that's where I want to invest. Anyway, that was the argument there. Oh, and what did I say I was going to go back to? Oh, the inflation. We've got inflation caused by stuff like Russia invading Ukraine. And basically what happens is there's a smaller supply of grain and fuel And so that drives up prices. All right. So that's the bad kind because there's less stuff. There's not going to be as much stuff to go around. The good kind is when there's an increase in demand. Okay, this is going to be after the OPEC oil embargo and fuel. Well, I have an example of that right here in the house since it's 107 degrees here today. There are at least 5 fans running, including one on me right now, at all times in the house because it's just so freaking hot. All right. So after the OPEC oil embargo, the demand for ceiling fans went way up. So presumably the price of ceiling fans went up. Okay, that's not a bad thing. I mean, if people drive up the price of ceiling fans, guess what entrepreneurs do? They make more ceiling fans, all right? And what did consumers want? More ceiling fans. The kind of inflation caused by an increase in demand is the kind that the market can actually deal with most of the time. I mean, but for example, boy, when we have a shortage of labor over here in this country, oh no, we better throw the economy into recession. There's a shortage of labor, which might drive wages and prices up. Isn't that okay?
Yeah. What have we been trying to do? We've been trying to raise the incomes of people on low incomes.
Right. What about, oh no, there's an increase in demand for Walmart stock. Let's throw the economy into recession. We don't do that, but we do when it's people, and that doesn't make any sense. So now, I will say there's an exception to demand pull inflation, which demand pulling up prices generally being the good kind of inflation, because if you let it happen, then the rising prices cause what the consumers wanted, and that is more of that stuff gets made. I mean, obviously, there are certain segments of the population that could be hurt. Let's say that it's housing, and housing prices are going up. Well, now you've got a problem with, say, the elderly on fixed incomes and those who are poor, but we've got other programs to address that. That's where we come in. We can come up with subsidies or whatever, but the kind of inflation that central banks set themselves up to attack is demand pull inflation. And ironically, of all the places where I would say that the market can do a reasonable job, it's there. And yet these pro-market economists are like, oh, we better stop it.
Yeah, the market stopped behaving like a market as we define it. So let's teach it a lesson.
Right. It would be awful if a shortage of labor caused the price of labor to go up, which would be perfectly fine for everything else. Anyway, I'm sorry, I went off on that as I do a lot of economic stuff.
Okay, good. We love it. So while we're touching on this, just getting back to the downgrade, I think maybe the day after or pretty shortly after the downgrade, 3 things happened. The dollar strengthened, yields on long-term treasuries went up, and the stock market went down. And I don't know if this is too big a question, but just looking at those 3 dials on the dashboard of the US economy, what's your sense of what went on there?
I was teaching a 4-week summer class when all that was happening, and I didn't pay any attention.
Oh, so it's your fault.
Exactly. Well, that's what they were saying in the press.
You caused that to happen.
It was John Harvey. But I mean, what little I did look at was like, yeah, the market was like, yeah, whatever. Even the market realized that was a ridiculous thing to do. But I didn't delve into it any more than that, just because, like I said, I believe this was the Thursday before I had to give the final on the Friday, something like that. I just got angry, is why I did Cowboy Economist and why I did a Forbes that day, and then I got over it. So
Yeah, no, you just have to blow off steam sometimes, don't you? It's funny when you do. So we're talking about currency transactions. You write in your chapter in MMT, Key Insights, Leading Thinkers, you write that interest rates tend to be the most important determinant of speculative financial capital flows. Is there any more to say about that, or did you just say it?
There were actually a lot of problems with the editing on that chapter because I had things in italics. And I said, now these things in italics are all log variables. But if they're not, then they're not. And the, I guess, copy editor italicized and didn't italicize willy-nilly. So I had to go through the whole thing and find everything again. And I guess think of it this way, that you're trying to decide, am I going to park my funds in the U.S. or the UK or Germany? All right. So I was like, well, okay, what rate of return can I get? Well, and I'm sure some people do this. I'm going to look at individual stocks in the United States, but that is so much work. All right. Now I have to compare that to Siemens in Germany, to, I don't know what's left in England anymore. British Leyland's gone, aren't they?
No, I don't know.
Okay, well, pretend they're not. British Leyland to Apple in the U.S., I might buy a stock index, or I could just buy a government bond. And if the government bond, I mean, that's pretty much, as you were saying earlier, that's a guaranteed return. And so a big factor in, well, do you remember right after the invasion of Ukraine, what was it that the Russian central bank raised interest rates to?
Double digits, right? Pretty quickly, right? Yeah.
It's overnight. And that was to protect the ruble from collapsing. And it absolutely worked because they're like, okay, well, I have to balance off the risk, obviously. But geez, 20% guaranteed return? And so I would not call it even necessarily a majority factor, the interest rate, but maybe 50% compared to all the other factors, because there's so many different factors that affect the price of a financial asset, but, of a currency price. But the one that is the most consistent over time, the one that you can guarantee when there's an unexpected change in interest rates, you're going to see a change in the exchange rate.
And what you just said would fit with the idea that the Fed made noises, I don't know, 3 weeks ago. It might be more than that, but quite recently that, okay, we're slowing down on rate hikes, and then there's been a stock market rally.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's and also the pound has strengthened against the dollar. That would fit with that, I guess.
20%. I just looked it up. It was 20% is what the Russian central bank raised interest rates to after the invasion of Ukraine.
Got it.
They've since pushed it back down again, because I guess it's not a lot of fun paying 20% interest. But otherwise, yeah, that's what they did.
And of course, there was this other thing where they also started demanding payment for their exports in rubles as well, which kind of, I thought was, I don't want to say, hey, Russia's doing MMT, but it's definitely the Minskian quote applies, doesn't it? That anyone can make money. The trick is getting people to accept it. It's like, well, you need our energy.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, yeah, that makes a great deal of sense.
We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener, and we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in.
And so also in your chapter of Key Insights Leading Thinkers, you have a section on the 1976 IMF sterling crisis. Yeah, what was your take on that episode? Because like you mentioned in the chapter, people who advocate progressive policies or perhaps not voting conservative often will get hit over the head with, well, Labour, you can't trust them with anything because of 1976 and the IMF.
I got to tell you, I wrote this several years ago, so I'm rereading it right now because I can't remember what I said. I know the basic idea was that people said that when the UK had to borrow the money from the IMF, that this was what forced them into these austerity policies. But the research, I'm not an expert in this area per se because it's more politics than economics, but the research I found was that actually the Liberal Party already wanted to do that anyway. The move to austerity, the shift towards the sort of neoliberal policies with the British Liberal Party and the U.S. Democratic Party, and then just use it as an excuse. And so that's no, there really wasn't a sterling crisis. There was an issue that was made into a much bigger deal than it really was in order for ulterior motives to be carried out.
Yeah, and it also, as I recall, it's only a short section in the chapter, but you were saying it looked like the austerity was a consequence of the IMF loan because the decision to implement the policy was taken before they took out the loan. Then they take out the loan and then the policies take effect. So it looks like the causality is running that way. But like you say, the decision had already been made.
Right. It really wasn't the causal factor.
Yeah. So turning to the MMT approach to unemployment and price stability, can you talk about what the neoclassical Keynesian pump priming is? Can you talk about what that is and how MMT is different?
Yeah, I'm actually in the middle of an article that I'm writing right now, and I can't decide if it's a stupid article or not, so I don't know if I'm going to finish it. But it is a piece on saying that when you are teaching the job guarantee, that it really behooves you to use Keynes's, I guess, model of the way the macroeconomy operates, that you can't really make a solid argument just on the social basis of the job guarantee. Now, I guess if the job guarantee basically says that if the private sector doesn't have enough jobs for everyone who's willing to work, then the government always stands ready to hire those who are left over, which sounds like an insult to them, but then you end up with a better trained workforce, a workforce that has not lost job skills and so forth, and who can address the terrible social problems that we have that the market has no incentive to pursue.
Let me just jump in because you said, it sounds like an insult to them. And I always think about Bill Mitchell's conception of, he's looking at the wool price stabilization scheme in Australia. The government starts buying wool if price goes below a certain level, and it starts selling it off if it goes above a certain level to keep the price of wool in a certain corridor as a way to safeguard farmers and agricultural communities. But he conceived that as saying, well, look, this is an employment guarantee for wool. We're ensuring full employment for wool.
And what an insult to the wool that the government had to buy, But yeah, and it goes so much further than that. Because at the end of the day, who cares if somebody doesn't buy wool? But it does matter if somebody doesn't have an income. Anyway, yeah, so we've got the job guarantee. And by the way, when I brought this up, at that little, I guess, civic meeting the other day, I said, this is a buffer program. When the private sector expands, you can sell it many different ways. And by the way, let me interject another story here that I'm sure I've told on your show before, but I was at a conference that Jamie Galbraith had put together down at University of Texas. And it was the very last session. And there was this elderly man at the end of the row in the last session who kept having to ask people to speak up and stuff. And I thought, well, who is this joker? Well, I'm an idiot. He said a couple of things that I have never forgotten. All right. And he was fantastic. I don't remember his name, but he was a labor leader of some sort, retired now. And one of the things that really hit me was that it doesn't matter if you get somebody to agree with you for the wrong reason. Just go with it. All right. And so I feel like that when I'm in front of a group of white, wealthy businessmen, if I get you agreeing with me on the job program, I don't give a crap if it's because you think, yeah, those damn people are lazy. That's fine. I'm not going to worry about it. I mean, they don't have to agree for the same reason as me. It's more important that it actually gets done. So anyway, I tried to sell it on that front the other day. And when I tried to point out in this article with this model, okay, so let's say we're at less than full employment. Let's say after the financial crisis, all right? The Democrats and the neoclassical Keynesians assume that we need the private sector to hire these people back. So what they want to do is they want to stimulate the private sector sufficiently to get them to hire all these people back. Well, a couple of problems there. One is that it's not just the private sector that does useful things. We have things that need to get done. And of course, again, if you want to make sure you sell this easily and then pick the low-hanging fruit, national defense. All right. So the private sector is not going to maintain a military large enough to actually defend us. We're not going to have a private sector like, hello, Mrs. Johnson, I'm Captain Smith. Are you afraid of Canadians? Me too. And then he said, the dog is on my lap. And when I knocked, he thought somebody was at the door. No, it's not the army. It's okay.
The dog's afraid of Canadians.
Right. Very much so. I don't even want to go into it. It's awful. But there's no way they could maintain a standing military. So there are things that we have to have done by the government because the private sector is not going to do them. Now, let's now extend that to elder care and child care and climate change. So there's one problem. The other problem is what makes you think when Walmart put in a bunch of self-checkout lanes, how much demand really does it have to increase at that Walmart for them to really hire back those checkers? I don't know that it's mathematically possible to get them to hire back all the people. Maybe they get hired somewhere else or whatever. I don't know. But I mean, it's very, very indirect. It took them, I'm going to get the years wrong here. I can't remember now. I believe it was 8 years after the financial crisis to get unemployment back to where it was before the financial crisis. All right. With an $820 billion program, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. It took them 8 years. All right. And so I was just showing my students in my macro class last week, I was just showing them that for less money than that was, and again, the money doesn't really matter, but okay, it's efficient. There's something in us, I think, that appreciates the idea of efficiency, even when it doesn't really matter. And so it actually costs less money to have hired every single unemployed person after the financial crisis for a whole year at $25 an hour, well above the minimum wage. And I did some calculations again for the book. I found that if we had had a job program, and I used some assumptions from Pavlina and from Fidel Kabub, Pavlina Cherneva, I used some of their estimates and I plugged in the numbers myself. From 2000 to 2020, which by the way covers two of the worst economic downturns since the Great Depression. And it would be, I'm going to think back on my math now, I believe 1/4 of the cost of the defense program or 1/2 the cost of Social Security to keep us not at a situation where we might be able to reduce unemployment over the course of the next 9 years, but to keep us at nearly full employment continuously over that entire time period. So instead of trying to indirectly stimulate the private sector to hire people back, which is what the neoclassical approach is, just hire them for God's sake.
I think it was Stephanie Kelton who tweeted, this is going back 5-6 years, that there was just 2 dots on a piece of paper. And there's a big squiggly line going from one dot to the other, the neoclassical approach. And then there's a straight line going from one to the other, the MMT approach. That's right. Well, the example I use is, I need to fill this bucket with water. Let me set it in my front yard and turn on the water sprinkler. Eventually, that'll work. But I might recommend taking the hose and just putting it right in a bucket. So when I've got the numbers right here in front of me, I just looked it up. It took 7 years and 9 months to get unemployment back to 4.7%, and it cost $831 billion. There were also the automatic mechanisms in place. Stabilizers.
Yeah, exactly. But if we had paid $25 an hour for that next year, as opposed to $831 billion, it's $670 billion. And not for eventually getting there, but and you wouldn't need to spend that much. You just wouldn't need to spend that much because it would stimulate the private sector.
Yeah. Just, imagine what it would feel like in a society where, the precarity was taken out of life, out of your economic life. How much safer a society like that would be, how it would feel. I just think, and this is something Warren said a long time ago at a conference, the only thing that's standing between us and that is what's between our ears.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It is absolutely 100% philosophical. I used the example of the New Deal to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when all of a sudden FDR is not a socialist anymore because he's spending all this government money. He's now a patriot because he's spending 10 times as much government money as he was in the first place. It's insane.
So I have to do this because we're in Britain here. And when we talk about doing fiscal policy differently to the way we do it now, for instance, with a job guarantee, which it would be a way to say that is letting the deficit float around a real world outcome, namely full employment. Or if we suggest more funding for the NHS, we will get people who will say, what about what happened with the Liz Truss government? They proposed something the markets didn't like. The pound plummeted, bond yields shot up. Wouldn't the market have similar veto power over progressive policies, especially ones that empower workers? How do we talk about that? How do we address what happened there last September? I think it was September 22.
I mean, who was hurt by a stock market crash? I mean, not your average person on the street. And furthermore, if I'm not about to retire next week, it's going to come back up once the economy recovers. So I guess that once again, to me, is maybe it's not negotiating with terrorists.
Yes.
I mean, maybe they will react like that. And maybe some of them really do understand the deeper story. And that is that this is empowering labor. And this is a turn in capitalism that they're not going to be real crazy about, where laborers actually really do have a choice. Because you want these job program jobs. And I know we say, well, we'll pay slightly less than the market rate. No, we won't. We're going to pay a living wage. which is going to be better than you can get at McDonald's. So I talk about this in the chapter. Is the price of a McDonald's Big Mac going to go up? Probably. So, I mean, the price of cotton went up, I assume, after the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, we better not free the slaves then. The cotton's going to be more expensive, you know? That's the kind of issue we're talking about. So, well, the stock market's going to go down. Yeah, you're right. And screw them. They are, of course, going to fight this transfer of power, which is what it's really about, way down deep. I mentioned before we were recording that I'm reading a book right now on the U.S. Civil War, and it's going into great detail before the war on the various socioeconomic changes that took place and about the rich getting richer and richer. And there were people who were claiming that wage labor is not much different than slavery because the worker really didn't have a choice and back and forth. And long story short, we know very well what's happened to us over the last 30 or 40 years as labor has gotten weaker and weaker. And a job program on a much deeper level is really about making the average person more powerful. And so, yeah, the ones who are powerful now are not going to be crazy about it. They're going to fight it every way they can think of. And some of it is going to be reasoned. They realize what's going on. And some of it's going to be panic because they like being in charge because they got lots of money. But screw them.
Yeah. And also, if you wanted to be technocratic about it, you can always point to Japan and go, look, the Japanese central bank tells the market what yields are across the whole curve. We're choosing not to do that. So if you're worried about some kind of gilt sell-off that's going to create a pension fund crisis like it did for Liz Truss, what actually happened was yield curve control. The Bank of England stepped in and started buying gilts of various maturities until they were back in the zone that the Bank of England governor called orderly. So it's like, well, the market stopped behaving like a market as I define it. I'm going to teach it a lesson.
Yeah. Well, what's his name in charge of DM25?
Yanis Varoufakis.
Yes. At one of Jimmy Galbraith's events, he was giving a talk and he was talking about not this particular scenario, but hey, stock prices fall, we buy them all up and we give them out to the workers.
Yeah.
I mean, then eventually I was like, before you could realize it, oh, wait, the workers on the means of production. I'll be danged.
Whoops.
Yeah, backwards way to it. Just don't word it that way. It's not going to be very popular.
Yeah. Especially in Texas, right?
No, yeah, well, we're getting the hell out of here. So one way or the other.
And if I read you right, so the job guarantee, this is what we've been talking about. It reverses this trend that really took off in the 80s, where it's a higher and higher share of profits going to capital, leaving labor with virtually nothing in real terms.
Right. I just didn't realize it was going on before the U.S. Civil War. These very same arguments were taking place, and more openly in many respects. There were people arguing that labor was the only source of value and that the capitalists shouldn't be getting all this. And apparently the Whigs, I guess the Whigs were more pro-market. But anyway, there's about to be a war, though. I do know that part.
So anyway, just to cap this off on the job guarantee, I think there's a wonderfully succinct paragraph clarifying some things about the job guarantee in your chapter. So I'm just going to lift it wholesale. Quote, the job guarantee is meant to operate as a buffer stock of labor, providing a two-way anchor on prices. It provides a floor price, the job guarantee wage, and it dampens rises in wages in a boom as it provides a ready supply of skilled labor rather than forcing firms to compete for labor already employed in the private sector. And I really like this last sentence. The existence of a job guarantee doesn't imply zero inflation or even that zero inflation is desirable, but rather that the policy itself promotes price stability. The price level will be more stable with it than without it. End quote. And I think that's chapter and verse on the job guarantee, really.
And the funny thing is, as you were reading that, I thought to myself, I didn't write that. That doesn't sound like me. And then I looked it up, and apparently I did write that. All right, well, good for me.
Great. Well, listen, whoever your ghostwriter was for that.
Yeah. But apparently I did write that. So, that really does just sum the whole thing up.
Yeah. Because I think some people think, okay, I get that it puts a floor under it basically enforces the minimum wage. It's not like the government saying to the private sector, pretty please don't pay people poverty wages. It's the government saying you can't. You're going to lose your workforce if you can't pay a socially inclusive wage.
And I don't know how you do it either without including healthcare.
Yeah, right.
Because what John Harvey argues in the unpublished volume is that if you don't have health care, then you're really paying. Well, first of all, I'll go through what a living wage is. And a living wage is not very generous. We go through it in one of my classes. I show them, I do the breakdown. It's about double minimum wage, but it's not very generous. It's like $8 a day for food, I think. I looked at the living wage for the county I live in, Tarrant County, Texas. And then I looked up various costs on web pages. What's it cost for an apartment? What's it cost for food? And you would be struggling. So let's say we have that, but there's no health insurance. Well, now you're really paying people we're already paying people different wages. One employee has 6 kids, one has 0. That's not the same wage, all right, that they're getting. But I mean, without the health care and child care, then we're still leaving ourselves with open problems we have to address. I don't know how well that would go over in the real world. It'd be hard enough to get the job guarantee through, let alone, oh, by the way, the military has it. How come that's okay?
Yeah.
So I remember I went to the Naval War College a couple of times for conferences that Steve Keen got me involved in. And we were sitting right at the bar afterwards and talking about economics and politics and war. And this retired Navy captain was like, well, I got nothing against national health care. Says, I've got it, and I think it's great. So, all right, well, maybe we argue on that basis. In fact, actually, I think I do actually mention that in the chapter is there are already options out there that people could be pulled into. Just use the military one.
Right.
For retired military.
What I also liked about that passage that you can take credit for, even though it doesn't sound like you, was on the high end, that the job guarantee dampens rises in wages in a boom compared to if you didn't have the job guarantee because you got that ready supply. I think Warren Moser would say the buffer stock is more liquid than people have gone into it, an unemployed buffer stock. And I think some people don't get that point that it works on both ends of inflation.
It just makes some sense. It's so frustrating how much sense it makes. That I don't know if you've seen the TV series The Wire. Oh my God, it was a great series.
So
every time they show those kids in poverty, I think there's no need for this. That there's absolutely no reason this should be happening. And we could solve this within 6 months.
Yeah. So, turning the corner. When we met up in London recently, you told us about how the work of Victoria Chick really helped you get to grips with certain parts of Keynes's general theory. And it was really interesting. Have you got the time and the energy to tell us about that?
Yeah, always to talk about Victoria Chick. Let me back all the way up to grad school. All right. So in grad school, I'm taking the grad level macro stuff and really depressed. Because I thought it was going to be better than this. I just thought it was horribly uninteresting and terribly unrealistic. And I thought, what have I done? I've got no backup plan. Then one day, I went down to my office and I found a copy of Alfred Eichner's A Guide to Post-Keynesian Economics and found it on my desk, started reading it. And I was like, okay, now I know what I want to do. I'll do your stupid PhD, and then I'll do what I want afterwards. And of course, the crazy thing is there were a bunch of institutionalists there, but they weren't teaching the core theory classes. They were teaching economic history and history of economics, classes I thoroughly enjoyed, but I didn't want to do economic history. Well, I took a field in economic history, but as a background field, I wanted to do exchange rates and business cycles. And Paul Davidson ended up there when I still had a couple of years to go, but I was already done with all my classes. So anyway, I come out of out of grad school, having really the most inspired I had been by any macro thing was Keynes's general theory. I also didn't understand it. And I remember working my way through it with Dr. Jensen, God rest his soul. He was my mentor, my very first econ class ever, undergrad, and he was on my dissertation committee in grad school. A great guy. Fought in the resistance in World War II against the Nazis in Denmark. So there's not much more you can say about a guy than that. So I was taking the history of economic thought, and it was the Marx-Keynes semester, and I'm having to read the general theory. I'm bogged down in the chapter on measurements and so forth. You know, just to skip it. Thank you. How often do you have the professor say that? Just skip that chapter. Yeah, so I'm still working with, so I took that from then on. If I'm not understanding something, I'll just keep on moving and see what I can get out of it this round through. So I get to TCU in 1987, and I knew what stuff I really liked, but it all was just a mess in my head still. And back in those days, of course, you really used the library. I have to tell you, I had an honors student who was doing her thesis with me several years ago, and one of the things I assigned her to do was get a book out of the library. She's like, I've never done that before. She was all excited to go get a book out of the library. So back in the old days, that's all we did. And so one thing I really enjoyed about those days was, I mean, it's better today. The ease with which we can get hold of materials is incredible today. But back in those days, you would pick out a section on the Dewey Decimal System and just look at all the books and see which ones caught your fancy. And there was one there already by Victoria Chick called Macroeconomics After Keynes. I didn't know who she was, and I'm pretty new to all this. But see, TCU had been full of institutionalists. And so there was a really good set of books there already for me to draw from. So anyway, I pulled this out, and it was a result of her teaching her graduate level course on, I think it was graduate level, I can't remember, but a course on the general theory for some years, and things she and her students had worked out together, but probably being very kind of her, probably just her, but nevertheless, that's what she said in the book. And so the book is organized so that it's not necessarily chapter by chapter in the general theory, but there's a place in there where you can say, if you're trying to figure out chapter 3, go to this chapter, and that sort of thing. So, all of a sudden, and as she says, I mean, the problem is that it's not, I don't want to say it's not well written, but he's backing off on a lot of the stuff he really believes because he wants someone to listen. And so he's only disagreeing as much as he has to, and he's in a hurry. And you have 2 articles the next year trying to straighten out here's what I just said in that book. One also called The General Theory of Employment, and one, The Ex-Ante Theory of the Rate of Interest. So there's a couple articles right afterwards saying, no, this is what I meant. No, and you're right, I left that off, and so forth. So it's not a perfect book. But with her supplement, all of a sudden things fell together for me in a way that they never have before, particularly in the labor market stuff, which he deals with very quickly and then moves on. I'll say something else about that presentation I made to that little civic group a couple of weeks ago. I'll tell you what, with lower unemployment right now, said this one fella, get rid of the damn minimum wage. Well, we have a labor shortage. I didn't point that out. And I could not believe he went for this. There were so many directions I could have gone with this, including Victoria Chick's direction. All I said was that would also lower demand. Oh, yeah. He actually accepted that. I was surprised because that one is a little bit more complicated because it depends on how much it lowers demand versus how many more workers firms hire. Depending on the elasticities, you could technically end up better off. But anyway, so I was happy he took it. But, she goes through and she says, look, if you picture the typical labor supply and demand diagram, the neoclassical/classical view is that the only equilibrium point is the intersection. At that point, everyone who wants a job at the going wage rate has a job. If you're below it, then there's an excess demand for labor. If wages are too low, there's an excess demand for labor, but then we don't have the Fed cause a recession, hopefully, and the market kicks in and it drives up the wage rate, right? So you can't be in equilibrium below the intersection. And she says Keynes agrees with that. If there's a labor shortage, it will drive up wages. So you can't be below the intersection on a labor market diagram. But where we disagree is, Keynes versus everyone else, is above the intersection. Above the intersection, the neoclassical view is, there'll be workers competing amongst themselves for jobs, and this will drive down wages until everyone who wants a job has a job, unless there's something stopping wages from coming down, like a minimum wage law. And Keynes said that's not the way it works. He doesn't say this clearly at all in the general theory. If you have this in your head and then you read it, you can see it. But otherwise, it's not clear from the general theory. What he says is, above the intersection, the firm's demand curve holds. All right. They are only going to hire as many people as they think they want. But if that number is short of how many people are willing to work, there is no mechanism that drives the wage rate down automatically because firms have to be hiring. For example, in the middle of the Great Depression in the United States with 25% unemployment, with no welfare, no unemployment insurance, do you think there were people who were willing to work for less? Of course there were. And they're pulling up their homes and driving to other parts of the country to find a job. But guess what? When they got there, I'm doing a grapes of wrath thing here. When Henry Fonda and his family get there, there aren't actually the jobs, right? So, the firm decides how many workers they want, and they always win. Workers can want more work, but if there's no jobs, there's no jobs, and there's no mechanism that is somehow driving the wage rate down because there is no competition among workers because for many reasons. That competition among workers that drives wage rates down certainly does not operate in the cyclical way. I'm sure that in a longer way, it holds wages low, but not sufficiently. Anyway, that was one of the many things that I read in there that I was like, So that's what the hell that part means. And that became a regular part of my knowledge. And I'll say one more thing about Victoria Chick. When I finally got to meet her at an Association of Heterodox Economics meeting, and I told her how much her work had meant to me and so forth, and then she was there for my presentation. And then I was at another one of the conferences sometime later, and I always want to assume people don't remember me, so I always reintroduce myself. That way it avoids any embarrassment. And so I introduced myself again to her, and she said, "Oh, yes, you're the one that makes the funny presentations." Yes, that is, you're the one with the deep, insightful thoughts. No, that was okay with it. It was perfectly okay. I mean, I was like, okay, yes, that is me. Thank you. Anyway, that's my Victoria Chick story. God rest her soul. And when she left a bunch of money to the post-Keynesian thought network that they are using to revamp the whole organization and make it more active. Really nice.
That's good news. Yeah. Look, it's been great to talk, and thanks for being so generous with your time, John. Before we wrap up, tell us about anything and everything you've got going on, coming up, online, offline, events, publications, anything else that's going on out there.
Yeah, it's going to be a busy semester. I just got our shared professorship in the department, which means that my teaching load is now down to 2 classes a year, which is incredible. Except I'm teaching 4 classes in the fall. What the hell's wrong with me? I'm teaching the one I'm required to teach, plus I'm doing an extra one because I just want to do a service. It's a class that I'm trying to orient towards underrepresented groups in our department, but it's a little bit hard to target that. But anyway, I'm doing my best. And then I also ended up with another class because one of my advisees needed it to graduate. Say, okay, I'll make up a class for you. And then I'm doing the Torrens class. So it's going to be a very busy fall. I'm also trying to finish off my book this fall. And also, I did have a paper I needed to write for the Association for Evolutionary Economics Conference in San Antonio in January. And I emailed yesterday to see, so is that session still going to happen? No, the session fell through. Oh, thank you, God. Because I still want to write that article, but now I don't have to write that article. So that was a great relief, actually. So that was really nice. So I've got all my classes ready, including the Torrens one. I put it all together. I am looking forward to getting to January so that this semester is done. And then in February of next year, I don't know if you've heard of this woman, we're having Stephanie Kelton come out to TCU to do a presentation for us. As part of my new position, I have my own budget, and so we're going to have her fly out. She was hoping that she and her husband could come out for a TCU football game, but it wasn't going to work out. So it's had to come in the spring instead. But that's going to be really nice.
So lots to look forward to there. That's a great place to leave it. I've been talking to Professor John T. Harvey. In case you didn't know, we will link to all things John in the show notes. And I'll also link to where you can find out more about the Scottonomics Festival. That takes place next year on the 22nd to the 24th of March in Dundee, Scotland. No matter where you are in the world, you can attend the sessions because they will be streamed live. Speakers include Steve Keen, Dirk Entz, Ann Pettifer, Daniela Gabor, Clara Mate, and BBC economics correspondent Andy Verity. If you want to take your understanding of MMT to the next level, regular listeners will know that Dr. Stephen Hale is one of our favorite guests and an excellent teacher, and his groundbreaking Modern Money Lab is running online graduate and postgraduate courses taught by, I would say, the cream of MMT lecturers, including this guy called Professor John T. Harvey. There's a link to more about that in our show notes. And finally, for our Patreon subscribers, there's a link to all our patron-only episodes, including edited audio highlights of the book launch of MMT Key Insights Leading Thinkers and an episode with Dr. Sam Levy about economics in the movies. Check out the show notes for all of the above. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today again on the MMT podcast, Professor John T. Harvey.
Thank you, and may the force be with you.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.
Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm wandering on about stuff.
No. This is great. This is classic JTH, as far as I'm concerned. People are going to be talking about this for generations to come.